This is Monica Perez, and today we are reading the conclusion of Makers of the Modern Mind. So we've read this entire book, we've had a chat, and I'm going to actually do a little debriefing with William and Scott on History Homos. It'll probably be released right around the time that you're listening to this. And I anticipate, I haven't done it yet, but I anticipate they're going to beat me up a little bit on this because this guy's a Catholic professor and there's like a perspective that is unique. And it's, I don't know, I just have a bad feeling about this. Anyway, let's see what this guy, Thomas Neal, says himself about these 12 makers of the modern mind in his conclusion called Intellectual Imperialists. We naturally want to know, after discussing 12 makers of the modern mind, what made them outstanding. What essential factors do they have in common to account for their preeminence in the history of ideas? How do they differ from less important thinkers? Is it sheer power of the mind that raises them above the level of the others? Are they heroes of the intellect, the manipulators of history that Carlyle would have them? Or are they simply fortunate figures selected haphazardly by fate for a role shaped by economic, political, and social circumstances over which they had no control? To answer these questions, even tentatively, we must see what they had in common and what distinguished them from lesser lights, such as Nietzsche or Henry Adams. Examination of the extrinsic circumstances surrounding these men reveals few hard and fast conditions necessary for becoming a power in intellectual history. One thing they hold in common is their longer than ordinary lifespans. I think quite a few of them weren't married also, but that's just me. Their average age is over 70, considerably beyond the average for Europeans throughout the past 4.5 centuries. 5 of them, Kant, Bentham, Newton, Freud, and Dewey, were more than 80 when they died. Only 2 of them, Descartes and Calvin, were under 60. Descartes died at 54, the shortest lived of the 12. The importance of longevity must not be overstressed, however, for Newton accomplished his greatest work before he was 25, and Calvin wrote the Institutes when he was 27. I'll say 2 things about that. Doesn't mean that they didn't spend the rest of their lives promoting themselves, but I always thought a long life was super important for John D. Rockefeller. He lived, so I always say this, like, what if you were the smartest guy in the world, the richest guy in the world, the worst guy in the world, and you lived the longest? Because I think he hit over almost 100, and so did his grandson, David. Imagine what you could do, because you start to see the patterns. You start, like, the older I get, the more I'm like, man, like, if everybody lived to 100, they'd have to come up with a different plan. So I think long life makes a big difference. Kant, on the other hand, was 57 when he published his first Critique, and Darwin was 50 when his Origin appeared. Some gave great promise as young men, like Newton, Descartes, and Calvin, but others attracted no attention till late in life. Locke, for example, was almost 60 before he published a thing. Some, like Bentham and Dewey, spent an entire lifetime perfecting their systems of thought, whereas others, like Rousseau and Newton, did their great work in a few short years. Some, like Freud and Rousseau, would have better reputations in history had they not lived as long as they did. Longevity, then, enabled some men to cut their niches in history as makers of the modern mind, but it is not essential for success. There seems little connection between physical health and mental vitality, if we are to judge from the lives of these men. Luther was robust, but Calvin was a bundle of aches and pains. Dewey enjoyed remarkably good health, but Rousseau enjoyed only his debility. Newton's body was so perfectly healthy he could ignore it, but Kant and Locke fussed around with pills and diets all their lives. Darwin's stomach disorder allowed him only a few hours a day for concentrated study, but no other demands than nursing himself and working up his theories were made upon his time. So although good health is not a requisite for good thinking, physical debility must be of such a nature as not to prevent one from intensive study. At first glance, bachelorhood seems an aid to powerful thinking, for half these men lived and died without ever marrying. The fact, yes, I definitely noticed that. The fact that 6 of them did marry, however, shows that a wife is no insuperable handicap to becoming an influential thinker. Didn't Henry Ford value his wife and she was valuable? Neither are children. Luther, Darwin, Marx, and Freud had families that would be accounted large by modern standards. But the fact remains that none of them allowed family affairs to distract him from his intellectual pursuits. Was it Rousseau who had 5 kids and putting them in foundling homes? Gosh. Darwin's household, like Freud's, was run by his competent wife. Both men worked in perfect detachment, cut off from household problems and the noise of children. Marx, like Freud, Dewey, and Luther, was a much loved father, but his study was a sanctum which the children dared not violate. All 12 makers of the modern mind managed to obtain long periods of time for concentrated intellectual activity. They did not have to endure frequent distractions of any kind. This is why there are gentlemen scholars that if you have that's what rich people should be doing. Let them think, let them do that stuff. Don't subsidize people from other classes to go to brainwashing colleges and whatever, be philosophy professors. I understand they have a certain point of view, but different points of view. Self-made people, heirs, whatever. Descartes moved to Holland so as to enjoy the privacy of a regulated life away from the distractions of his native Paris. Kant never married because he was afraid a wife would upset his scheduled life. No maker of the modern mind picked his ideas up on the run. Long periods of concentrated study was necessary for them all. The men we have studied took the business of writing seriously. With none of them was it merely an avocation. Either it came directly out of each one's occupation in life, as with Luther, Calvin, Kant, and Dewey, or it was made his life's work because he had an independent means of income, as was the case with Descartes and Darwin. This enabled all 12 thinkers to devote full time and all their energies to the task of formulating their systems of thought. They were no more distracted by earning a living than by family cares. Economic security would therefore appear to be essential for one who would think out and present to the world a powerful set of ideas. Certainly, he cannot spend most of his time struggling for a livelihood. That was Marx's big complaint, right? Like, how dare you expect me to work? Might have been nicer if he just did that. One extrinsic circumstance which helps to account for the preeminent position accorded to these men in the history of ideas is the fact that each of them appealed to an enthusiastic young group who devoted their full time and energy to selling the master's bundle of ideas to the world. The last of Dewey's immediate followers are now growing old, but they have done their work extraordinarily well. The ideas of great thinkers have always been spread similarly by groups, notably in the case of Marx and Darwin, Bentham and Kant, Newton and Descartes. What the popularizers lacked in critical insight, they made up in missionary zeal. Sometimes an official organization was perfected by the master to perpetuate his doctrine, as was the case with Luther and Calvin, Marx and Dewey. Whether or not there was machinery for selling the master's idea, there was always a group of enthusiasts who sold it to the next generation. Moreover, they always sold it to the right people of the next generation, to a rising group who were to control the destinies, the thought, and the lives of their associates. Lutheranism was sold to German princes rather than peasants. Calvinism was sold to the rising merchant class and therefore received even wider circulation. Rousseau's ideas were sold to the up-and-coming bourgeoisie instead of the decadent nobility. Darwin's to the younger generation of naturalists, Marx's to a proletariat that democracy and trade unions were soon to make vociferous. Dewey's to a generation of educators who were destined to have a near monopoly of control on American public education. Our makers of the modern mind, then, have few extrinsic conditions in common. A long lifespan is helpful but not essential. Such things as earning a living or managing a household must not occupy so much time as to deny their author long periods of study. A group of popularizers is essential in order to propagate the master's doctrine, even to impose it on subsequent generations, and thus ensure him lasting repute among posterity. But differences among these men are more noticeable than likenesses. Their personalities, for example, do not reveal a common stamp nor even a general similarity. Locke and Darwin were mild-mannered, easygoing men, whereas Freud and Marx were tyrannical. Luther and Rousseau were all heat and passion, impetuous in their personal lives as in their writing. Bentham, on the other hand, was a mechanically ordered rationalist, unmoved in his thinking by passion or enthusiasm or weakness of the flesh. And Calvin was a block of ice. Neither did the dozen men we have examined take themselves and their missions with equal seriousness. Descartes thought he was the weightiest man in the history of philosophy since Aristotle, and he was hopeful that posterity would accord him even a higher place than that given to the Greek. Kant believed himself important, like a fireman who rescues a baby from a burning house. For Kant was convinced that he was the man to rescue philosophy from the 18th century skepticism into which it had fallen. Marx looked upon himself as the Moses of the new dispensation, one who would someday become eminent in history for having seen the promised land and having revealed it to the proletariat. In the same way and with the same conviction, Freud believed that his was the dispensation which would reveal all truth to mankind. It is true he never thought that men would have sense enough to mend their ways, as Marx so optimistically believed, but at least they would be able to understand themselves and the civilization they had patched together. Darwin thought his discoveries important, but he does not seem to have attached the same overweening importance either to himself or to his work as did Descartes, Kant, Marx, or Freud. Similar importance was given to their doctrines by Bentham, Luther, and Calvin. Newton, Locke, and Rousseau apparently did not think either themselves or their systems of thought particularly important. Newton? Okay. Rousseau had absolutely no historical sense. He was so interested in his personal peeves and problems that he never had time to consider his ideas as anything more than projections of his own emotions. Locke thought himself only an under-laborer in clearing ground a little, whose ideas were simply those of common sense, ideas that anyone who followed moderate reason could obtain for himself. Newton was so occupied with making a fortune and achieving a social position for himself that he considered his intellectual achievements important only as a gateway to political and social preferment. Biblical chronology and divinity were his serious studies, he believed, and compared to them, science deserved only a nod in passing. These makers of the modern mind are not 12 intellectual giants, beside whom the lesser figures of history shrink in stature as they do in importance. These are not men whose intrinsic merit alone signaled them out for the position they occupy in the history of ideas. Darwin, for example, was absolutely deficient in any kind of abstract reasoning power. Newton was a genius of first rank in physics, it is true, but in the subjects he thought really important, he was no more competent than thousands of others who took up biblical chronology or alchemy as hobbies. Freud was a powerful, penetrating thinker in a narrow way, like a shaft of light shot high into the sky from a searchlight. But he was unable to think outside his narrow field of concentration or even to appreciate what went on outside the ken of his narrow thought. Luther was no thinker at all, though as a younger man he had shown more than average ability in philosophy and theology. Rousseau, again, had never shown intellectual ability of a high order. He felt strongly and he expressed his thoughts in powerful, moving prose, but he did no more than that. There have, in fact, been greater thinkers in every century than the 12 who deserve to be called makers of the modern mind. Wycliffe and Huss had said almost everything Luther was to say a century after them. They said it better and they thought it out more thoroughly, but somehow they did not catch on. Leibniz was a better rounded thinker than Kant. He was as fully aware of scientific, mathematical, and philosophical problems as Kant, and he devised a system to solve all difficulties. But he was not nearly so important in the making of the modern mind as Kant was a century later. Diderot was superior to Bentham as an 18th century rationalist, but even his editorship of the Encyclopédie did not make the citizen of Dijon as influential as Bentham became 50 years later. Lamarck explained evolution even more satisfactorily than Darwin. Big snaps to Lamarck. But Lamarck passed into near oblivion and Darwin became immortal. Epigenetics validates Lamarck, BTW. Many socialists criticized capitalism before Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital, and many of them drew plans for a more humane, more enticing utopia than Marx's drab, classless society. Many socialists showed a more thorough understanding of economic laws than Marx exhibited in his writings, but Marx is properly looked upon as the founder of communist doctrine, and the many other socialists are minor figures in history today who are mentioned only as predecessors of the great Marx or as unimportant heretics who deviated from orthodox Marxian doctrine. Oh, so we have sections in this as well. Section 1, let's just see. Section 1. Are we then to conclude from our study of these 11 men that they are just ordinary persons from a conflux of circumstances tossed into the spotlight of history with no regard for their intrinsic merit? Are they only persons who happen to reflect perfectly the popular ideas of a given age, ideas which in turn are a reflection of economic, social, climatic, and political conditions over which man exerts no real influence? In short, are these men makers of the modern mind through any merit of their own, or is it the concatenation of events which makes them great? Well, what about the third thing? Conflux of circumstances tossing them into the spotlight of history or capturing the zeitgeist are not the two options. What I think the true option is, something this guy's touched upon repeatedly, is that the powers that be, or those who wish to be powers, have the ability to promote this stuff. And that would be like we have today, media, politicians, academics, whatever is the church, maybe. But none of this stuff seems to be promoted by the church, that's for sure. It's all undermine the church. So it was maybe competitors with the church, the Illuminati or whatever. So this guy is not far down the rabbit hole, but who could blame him? Because this was written in 1958. My father fought he was in the Navy in World War II. And when he got backdoor to war in the 50s, this book, and then there were other books. He had a bunch of like eye-opening books. This is Roosevelt's Road to Russia from my dad's library. But he figured this stuff out only after he came back, and only because he was super interested, because it was such a life-changing thing. So I don't blame this guy for not being as deep down the rabbit hole. I didn't even get down the rabbit hole till I realized the Boston Marathon bombing, and then realized 9/11 in like 2013. So I don't blame him, and he's pretty close, but this is what I think is the truth. Marxists are always faced with that dilemma, as we have seen. They are embarrassed by trying to keep Marx's determinism undefiled while according Marx, Lenin, and Stalin their places as Herculean figures in the historical process. Trotsky's solution of the dilemma is a good statement of the Marxist position. Of course, we know that the working class will triumph. We sing, no man will deliver us, and we add, no hero. And that is true, but only in the last historical account. That is, in the last account of history, the working class would have conquered if there had never been a Marx in the world, if there had never been a Lenin. The working class would work out these ideas which are needful to it, those methods which are needful to it, but more slowly. That was Trotsky's quote. Okay. Historians who in days gone by tended to emphasize the importance of individual heroic figures would accord the men who we have studied a large role in the history of ideas. They would credit them with being heroes of the intellect whose single-handedly turned the flow of ideas into new channels. Napoleons of the mind, they would be pictured as individuals whose intellectual power changed the very course of history. More recent historians, on the other hand, would credit their success entirely to the economic, social, and political environment in which they worked. The dozen men we have treated in these pages would be successful following this interpretation only because they were in tune with their times. Neither of these interpretations is the whole truth. Each is an absolute statement of a partial truth. An influential thinker must possess unusual intellectual ability and must use it to say well what his age feels but has not yet expressed clearly. Kant's doctrine, for example, would fall on barren soil today because the world does not want an Alsob, A-L-S-O-B, Alsob, philosophy in these times. But it is not enough to be a passive piece of flotsam tossed up by contemporary currents, or else every popular columnist would today be a maker of intellectual history. The thinker must be of more than ordinary proportions, but at the same time, he must establish certain relationships to the beliefs and aspirations commonly held by his age. He must be in tune with its thought, sometimes accepting it rather passively, and at other times altering it somewhat by changing its temper and by adding his own contribution. But he must accept the age's underlying assumptions. He cannot become important if he contradicts the age's accepted beliefs. Like Descartes, he must avoid flying in the face of public opinion. He must trim his doctrine to the winds of the day. as Descartes did in heralding his view on matter as providing a better explanation of transubstantiation than the scholastic provided, or as he did in writing his principles in thesis form with the express purpose of having the Jesuits adopt the work in their schools. Neither can the influential thinker attempt to alter his age's opinions radically. If he tries to, he will appear a revolutionary innovator, and few men ever favor revolutionary change. There is always the possibility, of course, that a thinker who seems radical to one age will not seem so later on. His works will then be dusted off, and he will become a posthumous influence in the history of ideas, as Kierkegaard is today, as Marx has been the past 30 years. A maker of intellectual history must offer the world a set of ideas capable of being reduced to a simple formula. He must seem to have discovered the magic key which unlocks all mysteries bothering mankind at the time. Thus, Luther solved the economic, religious, moral, and political difficulties irking his fellow Germans by stressing the doctrine of salvation through trust alone. He had them put all their sins on Christ's shoulders, and by a simple act of trust, they relieved themselves of all responsibility for anything they did. Descartes' magic key was his infallible method, the use of which guaranteed to a rationalist that his conclusions could not possibly go wrong. Be wrong, no matter how absurd they might seem. Oh, he was infallible. That's funny. The others had similar key ideas by which they explained everything. With Locke, it was the common sense of relatively intelligent Englishmen. No more were logical difficulties to trouble men. No longer were they to follow reason to its rational conclusions. No longer were they to be annoyed by inconsistencies between thought and action, or even between one thought and another. They were simply to follow common sense, even when it arrived at conclusions which could not be balanced in the ledger of right reason. Then there would be no more bitter religious strife or civil war. Rousseau had his magic key too, his heart. Instinctive feeling is infallible, he told his readers. Follow it and you can feel secure that you are right. Its message is God's message, and apparent difficulties are not to worry the good natural man. Darwin explained organic development by struggle for existence and survival of the fittest, and his solution was applied to all facets of life. Marx explained all things in terms of the class struggle, from religious and art to beer and pinochle. And Freud found his magic key in the unconscious. Everything man does or thinks or says or feels is resolved in terms of the unconscious. Everything, therefore, is subject to the same treatment, and nothing is left a puzzle. It is obvious, then, that an influential thinker must not offer too complex or too profound a set of ideas to the world. Not only his key idea, but also the lesser ideas that cluster around it must be relatively simple. Exactly how simple depends upon the age for which the thinker writes. Locke and Darwin, for example, had to think thinly because the ages in which they lived were superficial intellectually. Luther, Calvin, and Descartes, on the other hand, could probe more deeply, at least into philosophical and theological questions, for their age was able and willing to embrace somewhat profounder ideas. Yeah, it was coming out of the Renaissance, right? Isn't that what this transition is really about, bridging from the Renaissance to the modern age? What about Kant, who, as far as ideas go, what about Kant, who lived at much the same time as Rousseau? The Genevan thought thinly and felt deeply, and he was influential at once. The sage of Königsberg, on the other hand, offered the world a complex set of ideas, and for that reason, he made almost no impact on the popular contemporary mind. Philosophers after Kant took up one or another of his ideas, simplified it, and passed it on to those who could sell it to the public. Thus, Kant's real influence was delayed, and it spread out in the 19th century along divergent lines, each one, compared to Kant's original doctrine, an exceedingly simple, all-embracing idea. Neither can a maker of the modern mind afford to be overly original. The large mass of mankind are essentially conservative, and they will greet original ideas with hostility. That's what I'm saying about the Pope. He says he's a unifier, but he also seems to have progressive ideas. That isn't how it works. If you want to drag people along to some future you envision, that's one thing. If you want to unify them, that's not the way. And Obama kind of had the same false promise, in my opinion. New ideas, in fact, crop up in 1,000 unsuspected places, and their creators usually remain anonymous. It is only when their ideas survive the test of time and when they no longer appear shockingly new that an influential thinker dare embrace them. In this respect, ideas are like party platforms in American history. New planks are put into the platforms of the major parties only when party leaders believe that they are, quote, safe. Safe, dangerous? Is that what Tripoli says? That they will offend almost no one and will excite universal approbation. Thus, it is left to minor parties to introduce new planks, like women's suffrage or prohibition or state ownership of public utilities, and to sell them to the public. When the idea is quite generally accepted in the country, either or both parties will warmly claim it as their own. Section 2. So it is with the makers of the modern mind. They are, quote, intellectual imperialists, to borrow the phrase Barzun so aptly applies to Darwin and Marx. They pick up various ideas propounded by obscure thinkers, sometimes knowingly and sometimes unwittingly, combine these ideas in a new synthesis, and thus stake out a personal claim to intellectual tracts of land which numerous predecessors had explored and developed piece by piece. Influential thinkers, consequently, are not intellectual pioneers. They are rather imperialistic exploiters of the obscure pioneers' discoveries. Their one big contribution almost always lies in combining various ideas into a unified system centering around a master idea. Luther, for example, united such things as German discontent with an Italian papacy, desire for freedom from ecclesiastical control, German mysticism, social and economic discontent, a desire for simplicity in religion, and a strong anti-intellectual feeling. These things had all been developed piecemeal by the 16th century, but it remained for Luther to forge them together at the right time and in the right setting. Thus, he became important, whereas his predecessors did not. So it was with Newton. All through the 17th century, men had groped towards one discovery after another in physics and mathematics. They had formulated the law of falling bodies. They had discovered the law of attraction. They had plotted the course of the planets. From Descartes, Newton learned analytical geometry. From Galileo, he learned the fundamental laws of motion. From Kepler, he learned how the planets move in their orbits. Newton had read of Descartes' work on lenses and on the telescope. He had read Kepler's treatise on light. He had followed the work on planetary motion done by Bouliatis and Borelli and Hooke. These were the giants on whose shoulders Newton admitted he stood in order to see so far. But the fact remains that only Newton could combine these ideas in such fashion as to become discoverer of nature's laws. Quote, discoverer of nature's laws. These giants have been lost in obscurity, but Newton has become immortal because he hit upon the key idea which banished mystery from the universe. The others turned lights on in hallways and closets. Newton seemed to bathe the world in light. So it was with Kant. The sage of Königsberg succeeded where Leibniz and Wolff failed because he combined and made his own the two great living ideas of the 18th century, Newtonian physics and Rousseauian morality. So it was with the other makers of the modern mind. Darwin picked up all the accepted ideas and attitudes of his age. Malthus's law of population, Comte's social scientism and worship of progress, the Hegelian dialectical evolutionary outlook, the general historical approach of the 19th century. All these, and organic evolution too, were explained by his master idea, which fitted in so nicely with his generation's assumptions. Dewey was successful in the same way and for the same reasons. His interest with practical problems and his pragmatic solutions seemed to show Americans how philosophers could solve the problems of mankind. Our makers of the modern mind cannot be explained, however, simply by concluding that they do nothing but synthesize the age's thought. Otherwise, every encyclopedic editor would be a towering figure in the history of ideas. The men we have treated in these pages made an immediate appeal to their readers because they registered strong protest against apparent evils or shortcomings of their age. That's an old trick. Then you can throw the baby out with the bathwater. Usually, the protest is vehement, as with Luther and Rousseau, Marx and Dewey. But sometimes it is rather by implication, as is the case with Descartes and Kant, Newton and Darwin, whereupon enthusiastic followers of these men point out how woefully inadequate, how thoroughly stupid all thinkers before their heroes had been. This protest appeal had to be nicely timed, however, to condemn what the age had already condemned in its own heart and mind. Yes. If it came before the world was ready for it, the thinker's body of thought smoldered for a long time like a delayed action bomb to burst upon the world posthumously, as was the case with Marx and in a modified way with Kant. Freud's popularity was achieved within his own lifetime because his condemnation of Puritan standards came at a time when these standards were already discredited among intellectuals almost everywhere. Although it appeared radical, therefore, Freudianism reinforced and justified the 20th century's basic beliefs. So it was with Luther's denunciation of Catholic practices, when the Church herself had already begun the needed reforms in Catholic life, and with Calvin's strictures against the loose living of 16th century Europeans. So it was with Marx's protest against the abuses of an uncontrolled capitalistic system, and Locke's quarrel with the extremes to which Cartesian rationalism had been pushed. The protest appeal is effective then because it is directed against already discredited beliefs or practices. Protest alone is not enough. Man is never satisfied with a purely negative approach. Our makers of the modern mind remained popular because they promised a better life in the future. The application of their various ideas always ensured a new world, which would be a better world. Luther offered his followers the nice possibility of eating their cake and having it too. They could enjoy all the pleasures of this world and by a simple act of trust assure themselves of happiness also in the next. Calvin promised to create a city of God on earth where all good men would be moderately wealthy, where the elect would remain always in control, where sin would be forever banished by law. Descartes guaranteed an errorless world where everything would be rationally arranged and ignorance would be next to impossible. Locke offered the 18th century a cushioned world where everything would be leisurely, easygoing, where bitterness would be unknown and contentiousness dissolved into common sense compromise. It would be a practical rule of the thumb world where a man could follow a few basic rules of decency, do moderately well by his fellow men without being troubled too much by their misery or their suffering, and he could save his soul by holding to a couple of fundamental beliefs. He could always salve his conscience with Pope by knowing that whatever is right. The Benthamites would have a rationally arranged world where the greatest happiness of the greatest number would be promoted, where rogues would be ground honest and misery reduced to a minimum. Everyone would be happy by being selfish in an enlightened way. Darwin's promise was somewhat vaguer, but it appealed strongly to his age. He guaranteed more and more progress, which evidently meant a better world peopled by fitter persons, where everything would be immensely improved by both materially and morally. Darwin's generation exulted in the progress they were making, and he assured them ever larger doses of the same thing. And Marx, of course, offered a utopia where each would give according to his abilities and receive according to his needs, a promise which should satisfy anyone. Makers of the modern mind, then, are men who ride the intellectual tide of their time. They accept the age's fundamental assumptions, protest against what it condemns, promise what it most desires. They articulate the age's thoughts and desires. They are nevertheless important figures in history, for the world is never the same after them as it was before. They act as foci for many ideas which without them would not be combined as strong forces for change in history. They can be likened to a glass which focuses the otherwise harmless scattered rays of the sun to produce a single burning beam, for they pulled together many scattered ideas and concentrated them in a master idea which became a power in history. It is therefore correct in a modified way to speak of pre-Darwinian and post-Darwinian mentalities, of pre-Newtonian and post-Newtonian outlooks. Luther and Calvin and Marx and all the others act as watersheds in the history of ideas. I will give him that. That's very good. Yeah. Each played a major role in changing not only the thought, but also the social and political institutions of subsequent generations. The world is changed because of them. Some of them, it is true, do not seem to have played particularly large parts as individual thinkers. I want to just say something about like pulling that stuff together. I think I've mentioned this on a show or whatever. I don't know if I mentioned it in this series, but about a study where it's language It's language that allows human beings to have super complex thoughts. And the study I was reading was in the context of, or heard about, was in the context of Down syndrome. People who have Down syndrome do not generally have sophisticated language. Some can't speak at all. My son is exceptional in his ability to speak, really unusual, to speak clearly, articulate, all that kind of stuff. So you think because they have lower IQs, they have less language ability, and it's kind of a hard concept to get around. They can't think because they can't think as well because they don't have the language. They don't have the words for it. And I'm only pointing that out here because the fact that these guys synthesized a lot of the ideas that were in the ether and made it into words, made it something that you could think about and remember in a master idea, would actually allow you to think about it. I mean, you could say more concretely, maybe it's not as good to have it defined for you, but the fact that they defined it for you determined how you think about it, how you synthesize all those ideas. Very interesting. So even if the powers that be or the powers who want to be greatly promoted these guys and maybe 10 times as many people did the same thing, they did have to do that. That is interesting. Okay, let us continue. Some of them, it is true, do not seem to have played particularly large parts as individual thinkers. Darwin, Locke, and Rousseau, for example, said effectively what others had not expressed so well. There is some likelihood that the world would have gone on pretty much the same if these three men had never lived. Their personal contributions to the history of ideas seem to be chiefly that they put their names on movements already underway, as was the case with Darwin's key idea of struggle for existence and survival of the fittest, a notion which Wallace would probably have supplied if Darwin had not put it forth so successfully. By doing this alone, however, Darwin and others like him crystallized the idea's thought with their own personal twist, changed its direction at least slightly, gave it new prestige, and increased its power for change in history. Other makers of the modern mind changed the course of intellectual history more markedly by their personal efforts. Closer to the Carlyle concept of heroes in the history of the human mind are Descartes and Kant, Marx and Freud. Socialism, for example, would most likely not have taken on its bitter, bludgeoning ways had it not been for Marx's personal interpretation of the laws whereby the classless society was to be achieved. Neither was there anything inevitable about the coming of Cartesian rationalism. Some system of thought was needed which would stand the test of the late 16th century skepticism. But there is no reason why Aristotle or St. Thomas or perhaps Bonaventura or Duns Scotus could not have been dusted off and refurbished for the 17th century. Descartes chose to build from scratch with his methodic doubt, and his influence on Western man's thinking and living has been continuous. His influence on Western man's thinking and living has been continuous. Rationalism became what Descartes made it. To a lesser extent, this is true of Kant and even of Freud. Somehow, someone would have had to reconcile rationalism and empiricism so as to make room for science at the end of the 18th century. But there was no special reason why it had to be by cutting reality into two distinct worlds of noumena and phenomena. Kant's solution was largely the product of his personal, peculiar genius. So too with Freud. It was certain by the early 20th century that the unconscious and the instinctive had to be explored, that their relationship with conscious, rational activity had to be examined. Freudianism, however, was not determined by the nature of the problem. Psychoanalysis is what it is today in great degree because of the personal equipment of its powerful pioneer. These are the factors, then, which combine to make a thinker influential on succeeding generations. These are the factors, moreover, which prevented other great, sometimes even greater, thinkers from becoming makers of the modern mind. It is noticeable, for example, that after Luther and Calvin, the list of men treated in these pages does not include a single great Christian thinker. Luther and Calvin were influential not because they were Christian, but because they cut men loose from the universal organization of the Catholic Church, and because their great appeal was in the direction of the world rather than away from it. Their stress was on this life and on things eminently practical. Newman was certainly a better, balanced, more penetrating thinker than either Marx or Darwin, in whose age and whose environment he lived. But Newman disagreed with the age's basic assumptions, condemned its underlying beliefs. He was, therefore, a dissenter from, rather than a maker of, the modern mind. So it has been with other Christian thinkers. Modern thought has been increasingly secularistic, going away from theology and religion toward practical sciences and filing cabinets. Christianity has been in retreat. Christian thinkers have therefore been relatively without influence, for they have refused to ride the intellectual tide. Neither have any literary figures been makers of the modern mind. Dostoevsky and Tolstoy were independent thinkers as well as able literary craftsmen, but they remained too independent, too romantic to influence the course of ideas and events late in the 19th century. So it was with Ruskin in England. He lived almost beside Marx, and he condemned capitalism as strongly as Marx did, often on better grounds and with better logic. But Ruskin failed to strike up real contact with the age's basic assumptions. He was not hard and realistic. So he gets into anthologies today where Marx is in the picket line, the public rostrum, the assembly room. Literary figures, in fact, almost always serve more as mirrors of their age's thought than its makers. Pope is the classic example here. Perhaps he said what, quote, oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. But his couplets came too late to have a strong influence on his age's thought. He offered many quotable lines, but only to illustrate a point in Locke or Newton or some other influential 18th century thinker. Okay, we're up to section 3. And this chapter, I think I might have to take a break right now and finish this next week. There's a lot left. All right, let's do that. And thank you so much. We're going to conclude this, and we have to start another book. But I realized that anything after 1978, I might actually get a problem with copyright stuff. Some of them have a very express, restriction against what I'm doing here. So anyway, I might have to go back to the drawing board on the next book, but we shall see. Anyway, but there's one more episode of this. So please come back for the part 2 of the conclusion of Makers of the Modern Mind.